Hi, Carl here for ProAV and welcome to the first of our camera comparisons on the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K. I say it's on that, but really we're just focusing on that. We've compared it against several other cameras. So we've used the GH5, the GH5S, the A7S, the A7R Mark III, and the EOS R. So we've got Canon, we've got Sony, and we've got Panasonic to pit the new Blackmagic up against. So let's explain a little bit what we did here. We've got 3 tests. The first one is just the same shot at the same settings on each of the camera, just to test things like color, to test how they each look natively out of the camera. Then we've got an over and under exposure test, where we ramp up through the exposures and ramp down, and then try and bring those shots back to 0 EV in the grade, so that we sort of almost rescue them. So we're testing highlight recovery and shadow recovery. And then the final test is we've got the same test as the first one, but with no artificial lighting and at 6400 ISO. So this is to test the color performance and the noise performance up at higher ISOs like that. So before we get started, let's clear up one thing, and that's that I did use speed boosters here. So for the cameras where it was possible, so that's the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K, that's the GH5 and the GH5S, I did use speed boosters. Now, I ummed and ahed for a while as to whether or not to do this. I know some of you are going to be happy that I did, and some of you are not going to like that I did. The reason that I have is that I think it is an advantage of those smaller sensors to be able to be used with something like this. And also, I talk to a lot of our customers that are using these sorts of cameras, and nearly all of them are using something like a speed booster. If not all the time, they at least have it in their kit. And so I think it is very, very common, and so it gives the cameras a bit more of a realistic comparison, rather than just testing what that actual camera is like as a sensor by itself. It's more like what that tool is like as a working tool for professionals. So in some of the tests, I've accounted for the extra stop of light that the speed booster will bring. Some of them I haven't. On the first one, I haven't. So all these shots are graded with just a very simple contrast and saturation boost, but the ones with the speed booster will have had a bit of an edge here. So let's start by looking at the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K. So this is our shot that we did for the same with each of the cameras, and this is our good friend Corinne, who volunteered to just sit there reading her magazine for the entire day while we pointed different cameras at her. It was a very, very dull and boring day for her, so thank you very much to her for sitting there and putting up with us. But what we tried to do here is we tried to get an artificially lit sort of interview style shot, which showed off various different colors, showed off skin tones, showed off a mixture of highlights and shadows. And I think the Blackmagic performed absolutely brilliantly. The colors are bright and vivid. The color of that bike looks brilliant. That's very close to what it looks like in real life. And sometimes that color of that bike can be very tricky to resolve properly. You'll see that on some of the other cameras as we go through the test. The image is very, very clean. It all looks brilliant. Now, of course, I based the settings for all of these tests on what was right for the Blackmagic. So that was the first one I started on here. So this was at ISO 400, at the right exposure levels that I would have set the Blackmagic up into. And then all the other cameras, I just copied those settings. So there's no guarantee that that's the right one for those other cameras. So the Blackmagic does have a little bit of an edge because of that. But it's safe to say that the Blackmagic performed brilliantly here. When we swap over to the RAW, there's a little bit of a shift in color tone in the skin tones, but apart from that, I really do not see much difference there at all in an average shot like this. Right, so now we've got the A7S Mark II from Sony. You'll notice a quite severe change in the shot here. This is because rather than changing the lens to change the focal length to adapt for different crop factors on different cameras, we actually moved the camera further forward. So because this is a full frame camera with a 35mm lens on it, we had to push right up closer to Corinne in order to get the same sort of shot and get the same elements in shot. So that's the reason for the different sort of focal length and perspective on the lens. And as for colors, I mean, I'm sure you could get this Sony looking a lot better if you graded it specifically for the camera and used their lookup tables, but just with a simple contrast and saturation boost, I don't really like the colours that much. The skin tones look a little bit green. The bike looks all right, but it's a bit washed out. We've lost a lot of the colours in the background from that fairy light. But just the most important thing is that the skin just doesn't look healthy anymore. In the Blackmagic, Corinne looks healthy and vibrant. Here, a little bit sort of dull and washed out. And that's purely because of the camera and the colour science there. Now, as we move over to the GH5 and the GH5S, something a little strange is happening with the colour. I think this is down to a white balance issue. The way that I white balance each of these shots is to take the white card side of the X-White colour checker that you can see there in shots and do a manual white balance off of that. And this sort of magenta tone that you see here on the GH5 is the same on the GH5S. So I don't know if that's to do with the way that that Panasonic is handling a manual white balance on these smaller cameras, or if I've made a mistake there somewhere. I'm sure some of you can point that out, but I haven't seen this sort of a magenta shift when I've normally been working with these cameras, and so it did surprise me quite a lot. But there's a very obvious shift towards magenta and a cooler tone overall here. But I think even despite that, the colour and the skin tone still looks all right. It's a little cold and magenta, sure, but it still looks okay. You can tell that if it was warmed up a little bit, that would look pretty good. And overall, the image is very, very sharp. But I think the most important thing here is the skin tones. I think with a little bit of warming up, they're going to be significantly better than the Sony, but not as good as the Blackmagic. The GH5S is a very similar situation. I think it has handled the white balance a little bit better. This doesn't look quite as magenta, and the skin tones look much more natural. But again, it has not quite hit the nail on the head with the white balance. You've also got that same very sharp look from the GH5. Perhaps I think it's a little bit too sharp, a little bit too digitally sharp, but that's very, very subjective. I know a lot of people really like that look. Personally, I prefer the slightly more detailed, less sharp look of the Blackmagic and some of the other cameras. But one thing's for certain, if you want sharp pictures, particularly for something like a big wide shot, the Panasonics do a great job with that. The Sony A7R Mark III is another interesting one. We've obviously moved much further forward here again because it's a full frame sensor. And in S-Log3, I think the colours look a little bit better than they did on the A7S Mark II with S-Log2. The skin tones look more natural. They're still a little bit on the green side, but they look much more natural. And with a bit of a grade, you could certainly get that looking absolutely fantastic. It's a little noisier overall, but nothing too bad. And I think the sharpness is a nice mix between being detailed and sharp. As we swap over to S-Log2, you can see the colours go back a little bit. It's cleaner overall, but it's not handling the colour of that bike or the colour of her skin quite as well as S-Log3 is. Now this is the EOS R from Canon, and it's got a very different look to a lot of the other cameras. I think the colours look fantastic, and it's naturally a lot more saturated and a bit contrastier than any of the other cameras is. I've applied very similar grades to each of these, and on this I think it just looked a little bit too strong. I'd perhaps dial it back if I was making this look how I wanted it to for an actual project. But the colour of the bike looks fantastic, really natural, really vivid. Her skin looks fantastic, maybe a little oversaturated, but very, very warm and healthy and natural looking. And the extra contrast is because of the log curve. Because the EOS R is using the C-Log1 rather than C-Log2 or C-Log3, which those Log2 or Log3 would be much more comparable to Vlog or Blackmagic Film or S-Log2 or 3 like the other cameras use. C-Log1 is sort of halfway between a log curve and a normal sort of YDR style curve, where it is log, but it's not quite as flat and as log-like as some of the other ones. So that's the reason it's a bit more contrasty here. But again, you could grade that to pretty much look however you wanted, so it's not much of an issue. Overall, I really actually like how the Canon looks. The one thing that does bug me though is that we had to move a lot further back on this because of that crop, and because we couldn't use a speed booster like we can on the Blackmagic or on the GH5s, and we couldn't get around that crop, which is a bit of a shame to work with. But in terms of how the actual image looks, I'm really pleased. So as we move on to some split screens, this is the RAW versus the ProRes on the Blackmagic, and here you can see a little bit more that color tone difference that I was talking about. Maybe the ProRes is a little bit warmer in the skin tones natively, but they're really, really close. You could certainly cut between these without any issues whatsoever. And so I really don't think there's much of a problem at all with the Blackmagic about choosing ProRes when you need ProRes and Cinema DNG for the shots where you need Cinema DNG and that raw recovery. They cut really well between each other. At first glance, you really can't tell much of a difference at all between these two shots. Against the GH5, you instantly notice that white balance issue. It's a little bit more magenta, but overall, I think the images look really great. That slightly sharp look of the GH5 is still there. If you look at her hair in particular, I don't know how well that's going to show up on YouTube, but there's just a little bit more crispiness in the GH5, which I'm not a huge fan of. On the Blackmagic, you can still see all the strands of her hair. It looks very detailed, but without that crispiness. And the color of the bike is very interesting. I think the Blackmagic definitely resolves the color of that bike a little bit more realistically. The GH5, even though it's got that white balance issue, is still making the bike that little bit more orange. It's a very similar story with the GH5S, but the color tone is a little bit more in line, particularly the skin tones. I think with a little bit of warming up and a little bit of a saturation in them, they're going to look absolutely fantastic and just as good as the Blackmagic does, really. But the color on all the other things, if you look at the orange background, if you look at the bike, is a little different. Against the A7S, that green tone instantly jumps out to me. You're looking at the bike is very different. You're looking at her skin. She looks much healthier on the Blackmagic than she does on the Sony. And again, with the A7R Mark III and S-Log 2, it's exactly the same situation. A little bit green on the skin tones on the Sony, and the Blackmagic definitely looks more healthy. With S-Log 3, this changes a little bit. The skin tones definitely look a bit desaturated on the Sony, but that green tint is a lot less noticeable. The bike actually looks much more realistic and it's lost that orange tone. I think with a bit of saturation and some work in post, that Sony in S-Log 3 is going to look brilliant. It has introduced more noise though. So particularly seeing here side by side with the Blackmagic, you can see much more noise on the wall behind her in the S-Log 3 shot than you can in the Blackmagic. Now the EOS R is a really interesting comparison, particularly the bike. The EOS R is rendering it not quite as orange as some of the other cameras, but it's a little bit more orangey than the Blackmagic is doing it. I'd say neither of these are quite 100% accurate on what the bike is actually like. You could make them look 100% accurate in post-production, of course you could, but maybe the EOS R is a little bit too orange and the Blackmagic is a little bit too magenta, but they're both really, really close with that bike. And with the skin tones, I think the EOS R is just that little bit more saturated, but both of them look fantastic. EOS R is definitely looking for that Canon mentality of maybe not quite as cinematic as the Blackmagic, but definitely very healthy, strong, looks good straight out of the camera. It's like a very, very good video look, if you like. Whereas the Blackmagic is definitely trying to emulate maybe the Arri way of thinking where they desaturate some of the skin tones. It's not right for every project, but I'm sure it's going to please an awful lot of people. At the end of the day, I think the skin tones look great on both of them. I think the color reproduction is great on both of them, and the sharpness actually looks very similar. The EOS R is noticeably contrasty though because of that C-Log 1, whereas the Blackmagic is definitely that little bit flatter. So for test 2, we wanted to specifically look at the highlight recovery and the shadows recovery for each camera. So the way that we do this is we do a shot at what we call 0 EV or 0 stops, and that's just how we would normally shoot that scene. And then we open up the iris a little bit for 1 stop, then we raise the ISO for 2 stops and 3 stops. And then with each of those, what we do is we try and match the grade of the 0 EV in post. So we grade that average 0 shot. Then with the +1, +2, and +3 shots, we try and grade those down so that they look as similar as possible to that original perfect shot. What this is going to test is if you overexpose by accident, or you want to recover something right up there in the highlights, how effectively are you going to be able to do that? Then we do the underexposure ones, and so we go -1, -2, -3. This is normally by stopping down the lens, and we do exactly the same thing. We try and grade it back to match that original normal shot, and this is to test how much information is there in the shadows, how noisy do those shadows get when you bring them up, and if you underexpose your shot, how well are you going to be able to recover that and make it look normal? So with these tests, we have adapted for the speed booster. So the speed booster adds an extra stop of light. And so what we've done is we've compensated for that in the settings. And so you'll see that with the settings as we go through these tests. First up, we've got the Blackmagic and the overexposure. So the way to read all these screens is we've got 0 stops, the normal shot there on the left, and then +1, +2, and +3, or -1, -2, and -3 over here on the right in split screen. So as you can see, the 0 looks fantastic. And what's interesting with the Blackmagic and stands out straight away is how great and how similar the +1 and +2 stops look. But then how awful the +3 stops look. It really does fall off a cliff. All the information has gone in her face. That table behind her completely gone. Those are really the two key areas you need to keep looking at throughout this test. Because if you look at +2, they're fantastic. No information is gone whatsoever, which is brilliant. But then at +3, all of the information is gone. It's a really drastic change. As we go over to the underexposure tests, the main thing you're going to want to look out for is one, how much noise there is. So if you look at the 300% crop on the right, but also, is there any nasty patterns within that noise? Are there lots of flashes of different colors? Are there horizontal or vertical lines and banding, particularly lines or banding of different funny colors? That's the sort of things we need to look out for, and that's the sort of thing that can be really hard to get rid of with noise reduction in post. With the Blackmagic, -1 stops looks fantastic, -2 is starting to get quite noisy, and -3 is very noisy. But I can't see any of those nasty lines or color patches. I think if we needed to recover this in post, in Resolve, we absolutely could. There's maybe some horizontal lines going on a little bit, but nothing too extreme. With the EOS R, the overexposure tests are quite interesting. +1 and +2 again look fantastic. Maybe a little bit of clipping on the +2 there on the tablecloth, but nothing too much. +3 is where it's really interesting, especially if you think back to the Blackmagic. It's held a lot more information in her face and a lot more information in the table. It has clipped a little bit on her forehead and quite a lot on the table, but that clipping looks okay. It looks more natural. I think the EOS R has actually done really well in this overexposure test. In the underexposure test, the -1 looks great, the -2 is starting to get noisy again, and the -3 is pretty noisy. This definitely looks slightly worse than the Blackmagic did, particularly if you notice the bike. So that bike has now got banding in it and much more noticeable noise. I think this is mainly because of the 8-bit recording on the Canon. So because those midtones have got such a lot of tonal variation in them, they're struggling to be recorded within 8 bits. On the Blackmagic, of course, you're getting 10-bit ProRes, and so it's able to cope with things like that, which is a really difficult situation, a lot better. So I think that's what's causing it here on the EOS R, but there's definitely some noise and there's some patches of different colors dancing about as well. I don't think the -3 stops is usable. I think the -2 stops, though, looks brilliant. With the EOS R, you definitely want to overexpose, not underexpose. Now the GH5 is also quite interesting. I think it performs quite similarly to the EOS R in some ways. +2 looks fantastic, again a little bit of clipping on the tablecloth. +3 looks brilliant, again the clipping is safe, it's under control. One thing to look out for here though is the placement of her face, because it can cheat a little bit here. Because she was reading a newspaper in front of her, she was turning her head from left to right to look at the different pages. And here on the GH5, she's definitely got her head turned away from the main light source. And so the light on her face is slightly darker than it is, say, if you look at +1 down there, where her face is turned towards the light. And so that is going to be cheating a little bit here in this shot for the GH5. I think if she was looking the other way, we might start to see a little bit of the clipping on her forehead in the same way as we did with the Canon. But there isn't any of that here in the +3, but I think it's mainly because of the simple physical placement of her face here. Now as we move along to underexposure, this is where the GH5 really falls down for me. +1 looks about as noisy as the +2 ones did on all the previous cameras we've just looked at. +2 looks very noisy. +3 is completely gone. I think there's just this wash of magenta noise across the entire image. It's very, very noisy. There's nothing too nasty within that noise. There's no horizontal lines or big color blotches or anything like that. There's just an awful lot of the noise. You're going to really struggle to clean that up. It's going to make your end result look very, very mushy and heavily noise reduced indeed. And it's going to suck a lot of the saturation out. So I think that -3 really is not very usable or rescuable here on the GH5. Now the GH5S, I think is performing very similar to both the EOS R and the GH5 in terms of overexposure. +2 looks absolutely fantastic. +3, we're starting to lose a little bit here, but the clipping on the table looks fine and the clipping on her face is acceptable. I think if you had to use any of these in a pinch, you could get away with it. It's certainly not ideal. Any of the other ones look much better, but we are dealing with quite a severely overexposed shot here, and I'm really quite pleased with all of these cameras as to how well they've recovered that +3 stops. Again though, with the underexposure, the GH5S falls down. -1 looks fantastic here, it's very, very clean. -2 is starting to get noisy, and -3 really noisy. Again, you've got that same magenta wash of noise over the entire image, but you're getting a lot more nastiness in this than you did on the GH5 itself. Lots of horizontal lines, lots of big color blotches. Really does not look very good here on the GH5S at -3 stops. Now the Sony is a little bit of a surprise with S-Log2. This is the A7S Mark II. +1 and +2, as with all the cameras, look absolutely fantastic. The surprise here is +3, because I think this looks brilliant. I think this looks just as good as +2 did on most of the other cameras, and certainly way better than the Blackmagic did. If you look at the table, there's a slight bits of clipping on the tablecloth, but really nothing serious at all. Her face looks great. There's the same color issues across this entire thing as we saw on the other tests, but in terms of highlight recovery, S-Log2 does a fantastic job, even within 8-bit on the A7S Mark II. -1 and -2 look very clean actually, even -2 looks pretty good. -3 is being very heavily noise reduced, and you can see that. There's not that much noise, but it's all gone a little bit mushy because of the internal noise reduction, and particularly the wall behind her really has started to fall apart. The 8-bit recording is struggling there to recover that log because it's a very aggressive log curve. The bike looks maybe better than it did on the EOS R, which I'm a bit surprised by, but the wall behind her particularly has definitely fallen apart here. I think this is 8-bit struggling with log a little bit with that underexposure. So the A7R Mark III in S-Log2 is a very similar story. The overexposure looks brilliant, and as we saw in the other tests, the color overall looks brilliant. I think that +3 stops looks perfectly usable and really quite good. Yes, there's some clipping, but it's not a problem. The -3, it does seem to be not doing quite as well as the S-Log2 did on the A7S Mark II. The bike in particular is falling apart a bit more, and you've got the same problems on the wall behind her. I guess this is because of the higher resolution sensor of the A7R Mark III. With S-Log3 on the A7R Mark II, again, the colors are a lot better. We saw this on the other tests, and with +3 stops, it's looking fantastic. I think it's recovered even more of the highlights than the S-Log2 did. It's a bit flatter. I'd want to grade this a bit more so it's a bit more contrasted and a bit more saturated, but it's looking brilliant in the overexposure. With these Sony cameras, you really want to overexpose that log, not underexpose, because when you underexpose, it looks like this. S-Log3 is not doing well here at all with underexposure. -1 looks as bad as -2 did on the S-Log2. -2 looks really bad. -3 looks awful, to be honest. It's very, very noisy, lots of big blocky colors. The bike has gone, the wall has gone behind her. It all looks cartoony, over noise reduced, and it's really noisy. The 8-bit and this A7R Mark III with that high resolution sensor, it just cannot cope with underexposing log, particularly S-Log3. So let's go for some side-by-sides. This is +3 on the Blackmagic, the GH5S and the EOS R, and we can see just how much the Blackmagic has clipped here. It's very obvious, particularly if you look at her face. I think the EOS R personally looks the best here. There's a little bit less clipping. I think the clipping that is there on the table looks the best of the bunch, and there's particularly a lot more saturation in those highlights, which is helping her face out a lot. I'm really quite pleased with the way that Canon has handled this. Now the GH5, just a reminder that her head was turned away. I think that has skewed the results here a little bit. The A7S Mark II in the middle looks fantastic in terms of highlight recovery. You can see there's way more information on the background there on the table than there is on either of the other cameras. The Blackmagic, again, it's all just completely gone. We've now brought the EOS R back in for reference again versus the A7R Mark III in S-Log2. And I think the A7R Mark III is actually holding up really well here. If you're going to pick any camera to overexpose with from these tests, it's definitely the A7R Mark III. But I think the EOS R is holding up remarkably well here. There's just a few more clipping points on the table, but overall I think the image looks brilliant. But again, the Blackmagic has got a bit of a problem here at +3 stops. Now with underexposure, the first thing that jumps out to me here is just how noisy that GH5S is in the middle. It's very, very noisy and very magenta across the entire board. The EOS R, you get a little bit of noise, well, quite a bit of noise actually, but a little bit of banding in it. And the Blackmagic, there's noise, but it's not too bad. I think the Blackmagic has handled the underexposure of these three cameras probably the best. And again here with the A7S Mark II and the GH5. The A7S Mark II has fallen apart on the wall behind her. The GH5 has just blanketed this magenta noise across the entire image. The Blackmagic definitely looks the best. It's definitely going to be the easiest to recover, particularly in resolve. It's going to get you the best results here when underexposing. And against the EOS R versus the A7R Mark III, neither of them did very well. The wall fell apart on both of them. The bike fell apart on the EOS R. Blackmagic is a clear winner here. So for part 3, we did exactly the same as with the other parts, the same shot with each of the cameras, but we wanted to see what it was like at higher ISOs, at non-ideal situations. So this is not lit with our lighting here in the showroom. There's no professional lighting on her whatsoever. What's hitting her face is the laptop in front of her. It's the light coming from her laptop. Then we've got the fairy lights behind her, which have got a bit of a green tint to them. And we've got the window over her left shoulder there, which has got this funny orange gel over it as part of our set here. So it's letting very orange tinted light through that. So we've got greeny orange in the lights behind her, orange coming from the window, and a very low color accuracy white coming from the, a bit of a colder light coming from the laptop in front of her. We've started with the A7S Mark II because this is the flagship. I mean, it looks brilliant. There's a little bit of noise. Her skin tones don't look fantastic. They're a little bit green, but there's not that much noise reduction going on actually. There's no nasty mushiness, and overall the image looks brilliant. Apart from a little bit of a problem with skin tones, they definitely look quite green here. The Blackmagic, on the other hand, handles this really well. If you look at her skin, she looks fantastic. She looks healthy, she looks normal. That's a really great skin tone color. The colour of the fairy lights in the background has changed dramatically. It's lost a lot of its green. It's gone very, very warm and orangey, as has the light behind her coming from the window. It's gone almost red. But overall, this isn't that noisy. This is definitely the best low light performance we've seen from a Blackmagic camera to date. I really like the way this looks at ISO 6400, and the noise that is there, you could so easily clean that up in Resolve. The EOS R, I also really like the look of. The fairy lights have retained a little bit of their green tint, which is okay because that's what they look like. I think the skin tone looks brilliant. It's a bit more vivid, it's a bit more lively and saturated, but looks great. It doesn't look too orange, it doesn't look too nasty. The colour from the window looks a bit more accurate like it should do. And the noise levels are very under control, but without heavy noise reduction being applied. There's definitely some noise reduction. You can see a little bit of a mushiness, particularly in the outer focus bits of her hair, but it's all very acceptable. I think the EOS R did really well here. The GH5, on the other hand, has not handled it very well at all. There's lots of noise here and lots of noise reduction very clearly being applied. It looks like you've added some bad kind of skin smoothing effect to the image. It's made the entire thing look very, very mushy. There's a green wash over the entire image here. It really does not do very well at ISO 6400. The GH5S is a different story. The colours look fantastic, it looks very clean. I think there's perhaps the most noise reduction being applied here from the other cameras that have done well, like the Blackmagic, the EOS R and the A7S. You can see that her skin looks a little bit smoother. The the outer focus areas of her hair look maybe a little bit more mushy, but as a whole, the image looks great. I think a client would be very, very happy with this image, but for me, there's perhaps a little bit too much noise reduction being applied. I would prefer to do that in Resolve, but I think it's a great looking image. The A7R has got that green tone that we saw in the A7S Mark II. It's there in S-Log2, but S-Log3 actually cleans a lot of it up. It's still there a little bit, but it's a bit better. And both of them look very, very clean actually. I was expecting the A7R3, because of its higher resolution sensor, to do worse here. It actually did really quite well. Right, let's look at some side-by-side comparisons to finish up here. The EOS R versus the Blackmagic, I think, is a really hard one to call. The EOS R looks a little bit brighter, and I think the skin tones perhaps look a little bit better. They look a little bit muddier on the Blackmagic, but to be honest, you're getting really nitpicky here. Both look fantastic. I think which one you prefer is going to be very, very subjective indeed. The GH5S also looks fantastic. There's less noise than there is on the Blackmagic, but that's because it's applying so much noise reduction. I think the Blackmagic is going to be able to look just as good as the GH5S does here, with a bit of cleaning up in Resolve. Probably better, because the Resolve is going to handle that noise reduction better than the GH5S is doing internally. But as a straight out of camera high ISO shot, that GH5S is hard to beat. It looks fantastic. The GH5, on the other hand, looks really quite bad. That green tint is so noticeable across the entire image, and it's a horrible combination of being very, very noisy and applying a lot of noise reduction. The GH5 definitely doesn't perform anywhere near as good as the GH5S does, or to be honest, any of the other cameras here at high ISOs. The A7R Mark III looks very clean and with very few noise reductions. The skin tones difference is hugely obvious here though when you see it side by side with the Blackmagic. And notice the out of focus areas because of the full frame sensor. Even when you are using a speed booster with the Blackmagic, that out of focus areas and that bokeh looks far nicer on the A7R Mark III than it does on the Blackmagic. But that skin tone issue is definitely there, even when we swap across to S-Log3. And the A7S Mark II, I think, looks just as clean actually as the A7R did, but with more of a pollution towards green in the skin tones. It's very obvious here. I'm sure you could clean up a lot of this using post-production and the right lookup tables / the right edit grading, but straight out of camera, definitely noticeable. So I thought I'd finish by bringing up perhaps the best cameras from this high ISO test. Blackmagic, the EOS R, the GH5S and the A7R Mark III, one from each manufacturer, funnily enough. And which one you prefer here is going to be a really tough one to call. I think they all look fantastic. A few things that really jump out to me seeing them all here side by side is the out of focus areas of the Sony, because it's using the full frame sensor. The bokeh looks fantastic. It actually looks really quite good on the EOS R. That's not because of the sensor size, because it's taking that crop out of its full frame sensor, but it's because we've walked further back with the camera, and so we're effectively on a longer focal length lens. The Blackmagic looks great. The skin tones look very, very neutral and could be really easily cleaned up in post. I think any of these cameras is going to do a fantastic job while you're shooting at 6400 ISO. Okay, so I know that was a bit of a long one, but hopefully that was really useful to you all. If you want to buy any of these or want to look for any more information on any of the products which we've mentioned here, all the links are down in the description down below. Let me know how you think each one of these held up. What camera do you think did the best overall? Was there any surprises for you within this test? Let me know what you thought of it in the comment section down below. We've got another one of these tests coming soon where we compare the Blackmagic to some larger cameras, so keep an eye out for that. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.